quote, and it's a quote from Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Luftwaffe of the German army back in World War II. And he said this in a conversation to an American intelligence officer who spoke German, Gustav Gilbert. He said, naturally, the common people don't want war, but the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. End quote. It's a significant quote, and not because it's necessarily inherently hateful, but instead it shows that speech crimes are broader than what you might think in the classic sense of hateful comments. They do include certain types of particularly hateful, derogatory comments, but they also encompass incitement to crimes, and in this case, the incitement to aggressive war. So during this webinar, we will look at how speech crimes in that broad sense can be prosecuted, and we'll also hear about how you can separate criminalized speech crimes and speech acts from protected speech, which of course is enshrined under the universally recognized right to freedom of expression. To do so, we're going to hear from two experts on this topic. Firstly, Lisa Biersay, who was a prosecutor for the United Nations on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide trials for over 13 years. She is now the founder of Bridges to Reconciliation, which provides consulting support to international criminal investigations and prosecutions. And she's a 2023 to 24 Harvard Law School Wasserstein Fellow. She'll then be followed by Jomana Kuric, who worked for 4 years from 2016 to 2020 in the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, as well as, among other experiences, being the head of the Human Rights and Freedom of Religion Commission of the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'll be moderating. My name's Matthew Gillette, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Essex and also a United Nations Special Mandate holder. The talk this evening is part of a series of talks that we'll be hosting linked with our new LLM that we're launching at the University of Essex, which is specifically on international criminal law. Now, the LLM will be highly interactive and immersive with legal skills that you'll hear about this evening. And in that spirit, we will ask you to submit any questions you have through the Q&A to make it an exchange. It's also a topic this evening of personal interest, as I'm working to research together with PhD candidate Vanessa Top on a new set of guidelines for the prosecution of speech crimes under international law, with a strong focus on social media platforms. So the plan is to have each speaker talk for 20 to 25 minutes and then move to the Q&A, which I will moderate. So with those introductory comments, it just remains for me to warmly thank our speakers for sharing their time with us and to pass over the floor to firstly, Lisa. We're in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Matthew. And I really appreciate your observation that it's a very important topic. And it is an area that is not full of clarity, shall we say, at the present time. So I appreciate the opportunity to share a few reflections with you about some of my experiences in prosecuting speech-related crimes. I am aware that this is an interdisciplinary group, so my goal is to provide a general flavor of my work, primarily focusing on the Vojislav Seselj case. Now, that case was tried at the trial level before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and it was also heard at the appellate level before its successor institution, the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals, the IRMCT, quite a mouthful. So before joining the ICTY, I had worked both as a state and as a federal prosecutor in the US. And as a federal prosecutor, I had only a few speech-related cases, primarily involving threats made against the US president that the Secret Service thought were credible, and cyber stalking cases, mostly centered on threatening murder. So I had a full array of cases, and those are the ones that were the most threat related, let's say. I joined the ICTY in August 2007 and was told on my first day that I was assigned to the Seselj case. And I said, yeah, no problem. And the one question you never ask as a prosecutor is, what could possibly go wrong? Because a lot can. And this case was very challenging in many respects. Before joining the ICTY, I had watched the BBC documentary, The Death of Yugoslavia, and I wanted to show a clip. But before I show the clip, Matthew, perhaps it would be helpful to show the extract of the map from that documentary. And so this map gives you the layout of the affected areas, and implicated in the Seselj indictment will be that area you see marked as Vojvodina, as well as Croatia and Bosnia, and Serbia as well in certain ways. Thank you, Matthew. So I just wanted to orient you so you could see the relationship of Vojvodina to the rest of the area. What I would also like to show you from that BBC documentary, The Death of Yugoslavia, and it's an interesting documentary in which many of the ICTY indictees had been interviewed, including Slobodan Milošević and Seselj, who discuss some of their roles. And so, Matthew, if you will, it's a short clip. It's under 2 minutes, and it opens in a very benign way.
Can I just check that the sound was working? Did you hear sound?
I heard sound.
Okay, great. I'll play this.
Unlike Slovenia, Croatia had a large Serb minority. Here in Vukovar, near the border with Serbia, the real war in Yugoslavia would begin. Serb nationalists in Croatia had already seized power in a dozen villages. They wanted to link them up and expel the Croats who were in their way. Then this pure Serb mini-state could join the motherland, the first step to the creation of a new Yugoslavia, run by and for the Serbs. To this end, extremist allies of President Milošević set about provoking a conflict between Serbs and Croats.
Srpstvo je u samim korenima ugroženo. Ustaške horde atakuju na srpska sela, na srpske žene i decu. Ustaške horde nastoje da dovrše ono genocid nad srpskim narodom. 1991. godine počinjemo masonije da organizujemo dobrovoljce i da ih upućujemo na već formirane frontove, posebno u istočnu Slavoniju.
The man whose job it was to stop such intrusions was the police chief of Eastern.
Yeah, thank you very much. It feels very much like the courtroom. Thank you for that. So keeping in mind that he wasn't charged for this early speech, but it's to give a flavor of the situation. And what do I want you to know? When you hear the word, the phrases hate speech, atrocity speech, or speech-related crimes, experts in the field are trying their best to bring some order to understand this rather sometimes chaotic realm. And as a prosecutor, I can say words matter. Yes, very much. But the import of them, the charging of them, will only be effective sometimes when you can show context, 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 and context. And the first context in the Seselj case was really, who is he? And of course, now he's an internationally convicted criminal. He was a gifted politician during the war in the former Yugoslavia. Keen intellect, persuasive oratorical skills. He knew how to press the past suffering of the Serb people from World War II to make them fearful of non-Serbs who were portrayed of trying to perpetrate a genocide against the Serb people. He was the leader of the Serbian Radical Party, sometimes called the SRS, and the Serbian Chetnik movement, which is essentially the paramilitary wing of the SRS. And in these capacities, he harnessed these gifts to instigate and inflame violent passions aimed at legitimizing and advancing the idea of this far-reaching Serbian state where there was no room for non-Serbs. So the indictment against him, the focal point of it was that he participated in crimes between August 1991 and September 1993 by way of a joint criminal enterprise. The common purpose of it was the permanent and forceful removal of, through the commission of crimes from these areas of Croatian, Bosnian Muslims, and other non-Serbian populations from huge parts of Croatia and Bosnia. Now, according to the indictment, he shared and advanced this common objective with key members of the political and military leadership of Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia. It included Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic. And he unleashed his authority and power to disseminate propaganda, to validate his hate-filled speech advocating retaliatory crimes against non-Serbs, to recruit and instigate volunteers called Seseljevci, which sometimes called Seselj's men, and to funnel his volunteers to fill manpower gaps in the field in Croatia and in Bosnia. The indictment charged him with several counts of war crimes. What's more relevant today are the charged crimes of persecution, deportation, and other inhumane acts as forcible transfer as crimes against humanity in 3 counts. And those 3 counts are based on speech-related aspects of his conduct in 3 places: Croatia, Bosnia, and a tiny, tiny village in Vojvodina, Serbia, called Hrtkovci. Now, it's important to let you know that the trial chamber, the majority, 2 of the 3 judges, acquitted him of every count in the 14-page indictment that covered numerous crime sites all over Yugoslavia. And the appeals chamber agreed fully, with the exception of his speech-related crime committed on one day in Hrtkovci on 6 May 1992. If it's possible at this time, I'd like to show the extract from Exhibit P547, which is a part of the larger speech that Seselj made on that day in Herkovsky Vojvodina on 6 May 1992. And in it, you can see in this village too, in Herkovsky, in this place, there is no room for Croats. The rest of the Croats must clear out of Serbia, including those from here, from Herkovsky, who locked up their houses and left, reckoning, I suppose, they would come back one day. But our message to them is no, you have nowhere to return to. Serb refugees will move into their houses. We should give every Serbian family of refugees the address of one Croatian family. The police will give it to them. The police will do as the government decides. And as soon we will be the government, we will drive them to the border of Serbian territory and they can walk from there if they do not leave before of their own accord. I firmly believe that you, Serbs from Herkovsky and other villages around here, will also know how to preserve your harmony and unity, that you will promptly get rid of the remaining Croats in your village and the surrounding villages. So this is the speech. Now, the trial wasn't designed just for this speech. It was a vast and comprehensive trial. And the way the prosecution team set about proving those vast crimes, very obviously on witnesses, surviving witnesses, surviving victims, insiders, experts, both internal experts, meaning experts working for the OTP, and external experts. And this came, the witnesses came either in live testimony before the trial chamber or through written testimony. There was a lot of material from open source, newspaper articles, magazines, videos, audios, NGO reports, had intercepts of communications, archival materials obtained through sending requests to governments asking for the materials or asking for access to the archives. And we also relied on adjudicated facts as permitted by the rules, so facts that had been previously determined and settled by appellate chambers. Now, think about the slide you just saw of the speech. Why did I show you an extract of the speech? Why didn't I play it? And the answer is we were never able to obtain the audio or video, even though we had many hours of videos of Seselj. But a brilliant analyst on the prosecution team had let's say the task, I was going to put an adjective, but let's call it the task of reading all of Seselj's books. And he was instrumental in collecting, understanding, analyzing the body of Seselj's hate-filled works. And because of his dedication, he found a transcript of the speech that Seselj decided to print in one of his books. So Seselj provided the evidence that would ultimately convict him. It was a very analog situation, just the transcript, the partial transcript reprinted in one of Seselj's books. So throughout the trial, Seselj worked relentlessly to persuade the chamber that during the indictment period, he was a simple opposition politician, and that he was merely being persecuted for his political ideology. He did it without ever taking the witness stand in his own case because he represented himself. completely free of the ethical and professional constraints normally in play with defense attorneys. And because he was representing himself, he was able to cross-examine witnesses directly, and often in the most vulgar and threatening manner that I have ever experienced in any courtroom. And from his cell in the courtroom, he carried out a campaign of intimidation and pressure, especially targeting his former SRS members and other Serbs who had provided the prosecution with witness statements and who were named as prosecution witnesses. Essentially, with very few exceptions, every one of them recanted completely or partially their prosecution statements. And this complicated the trial to a significant degree. And the complicated administration of the trial became even more complicated when Seselj successfully sought to remove one of the 3 judges after the case was closed. The motion of disqualification was granted, and voila, we have a new judge. Eventually, the new judge and the presiding judge would become the majority who fully acquitted Seselj. The prosecution's evidence, however, was so compelling regarding Herkovci that the majority had to find and did find that the speech was inflammatory, even though it acquitted him of the speech. And what was important for the appeal later was the context. So the prosecution showed that before Yugoslavia started breaking apart, that the village of Herkovci in Vojvodina was ethnically diverse. It had a Croat majority as well as Hungarians and Serbs. Witnesses described that there were many mixed marriages between Serbs and Croats or Hungarians. And the people of different ethnicities, they lived together in peace and in harmony. And that tranquility began to change slowly at first. And the prosecution showed the context before that speech. The accused had begun targeting non-Serbs in Vojvodina and Herkovci as early as September of 1991, before the war, during the war in Croatia. So before the speech in May of 1992 in Herkovci. And a witness described how Seselj gave instructions of how the persecution campaign should be carried out in Herkovci, dismissing non-Serbs from government jobs, threatening non-Serbs through intimidating telephone calls, attacking non-Serbs, attacking their homes, marking non-Serb homes, throwing grenades and breaking windows. A man named Ojestoja Sabincic, one of the organizers of that May 6th rally where Seselj gave the speech, was known as Seselj's man there in Herkovci. And he stood on the side of the stage during the speeches that day. And according to the evidence, in spring of 1992, this is before the speech itself, he and others traveled to the SRS office in Belgrade, where the accused gave them the green light to drive Croats from Herkovci. We also presented materials showing that on April 1 in 1992, so a month before the speech, exactly as the Serb takeovers were being implemented in Bosnia, the accused used the National Assembly to attack Croats in Serbia. He said that Croats should be forced from Serbia in retaliation for what Tudjman was doing to Serbs in Croatia. And part of the context is he targeted Herkovci as the place for that May 6th rally, because it was majority Croat and because it was considered Ustasha territory during World War II. And so not only did he target Herkovci as the place for it, he targeted the date. The evidence showed that May 6th was St. George's Day, which was an important Serb holiday. And according to reports that we were able to obtain and show at trial, there was a report by the State Security Department of the Serbian Ministry of Interior that showed that around 700 SRS sympathizers and citizens of nearby villages attended. And at that rally, there was a list of prominent Croats in Hrvatski that was read to the crowd. And Seselj himself admitted that a member of his party standing next to him read out that list. And those Croats were labeled as disloyal. And so with all that context, just think about that little speech again. If you just think about the context and now think about what happened after, and when he gave that speech and the appellate chamber found this, what did the crowd do? The crowd was described as applauding and shouting, "Ustasha out, this is Serbia, Croats, go to Croatia, this is Serbia." We also showed what happened right after his speech. And what happened was many Croats began preparing to leave Hrvatski, showing that they felt denigrated and threatened, just as the accused had intended. And by August 1992, the Serb leadership of the village had changed the name of Hrvatski to Srbislavski, forgive my pronunciation, to reflect that Serbs were now the majority. Even the signposts in and out of the village were changed. And reports of his hate-filled speech and the reaction of the crowd spread by word of mouth, from person to person, household to household. And Croats decided they had no real choice but to leave. Seselj warned them to clear out of Serbia, and they did. And he directed Serbs to promptly get rid of the remaining Croats in your village, in your and surrounding villages, and they did. And after the speech, Croats began collecting travel documents, and this was actually a very important part of the case. According to one witness, there were standing in queues and waiting like in embassies, and the prosecution presented evidence that the Croats began collecting records like christening certificates, marriage records from the local Catholic Church, so that they could leave and have some type of identification that they wouldn't otherwise have. And the requests for those certificates increased dramatically after the speech. And some witnesses testified that they left as a result of the speech. Now, a big part of that evidence came from the demographer, Eva Tabo, who did an analysis and showed that the number of Croats in the village had dwindled by 76%. And her evidence was vigorously challenged by one of the judges at trial and by Seselj. But the appeals chamber emphasized that the demographic change was further corroborated by witness evidence and press articles memorializing the flight of Croats from Hrvatski. So there was even an article that talked about Seselj's program to move out the non-Serb population from Serbia, and that it was becoming a reality. And a retired local policeman explained in that article that it all began after Seselj's speech here in the village. Many have already left the village. So directly following that speech, Croats were harassed, they were intimidated, they were threatened in exactly the same way the accused had instructed in September of 1991. Threats were coming in every day. Hand grenades were thrown at Croat houses. dogs were killed, and bomb threats were made. And it's in that context, that full context, that the appeals chamber was able to make a finding that about these acts and found Seselj criminally responsible and guilty for instigating crimes against humanity in terms of deportation, persecution as forcible displacement, other inhumane acts, and through forcible transfer, and committing crimes against humanity, specifically persecution, because of the violation of their rights to security and dignity. So perhaps I'll pause there because I know that we're conscious of time, but yeah, shall we do it like that?
Well, thank you. Bravo. I'll do the little electronic clap if I can. No, I can't even find that. So thank you. And what was really interesting for my part, reminiscing, was even in a case where you have the transcript of the speech itself, the amount and variety of different types of evidence that had to be brought, from the transport documents, birth register kind of documents from churches, and even the Eva Tabot's evidence from the demographic perspective. So it's really fascinating, because I think sometimes when we think about speech crimes case, we think it's just the recording or the transcript of the speech, but there's much more to it that goes in.
And there's a story about one of the prosecutors going to retrieve these big church books so that we could have them. And it does require creativity, for sure.
That's fascinating. And thank you so much. We will now turn the microphone over to Jomana Kuric, and to provide more of that context, and particularly as someone from Bosnia. So thank you very much. We're in your hands.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Is everything okay? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much, Professor Lisa, for your work, first and foremost, and also this presentation this evening. I prepared several things, but let me maybe start, and then I'll see how much time we have. So I would like also to share some of my insights related to this very important topic today. It's a very unusual situation for me, I have to be honest, because I'm kind of in a way wearing two hats, or wearing, shall I say, two headscarves. First one is the one of a practitioner. I do have quite a lot of experience of working with victims of racist and generally discriminatory violent crimes. As you said, I've been working with the OSCE's Warsaw Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights on the topic of hate crimes, and for quite some years now. And I have had the chance to work in many of the OSCE's 57 participating states. I worked with many marginalized and racialized individuals and groups, but also with police, judges, and prosecutors on discussing ways how to understand and acknowledge the bias indicators in the case, making it a hate crime, and words and threats and incitement plays a huge role there. So that's very briefly for now. The second hat I'm wearing this evening is that of a Bosnian Muslim woman who was 10 when the war broke out. And that's a part I don't bring out very often, but for this particular situation, it's important. So I am currently living in Bosnia, and I have, in different capacities, worked broadly on transitional justice issues. So I worked with survivors, with returnees, on hate crimes against returnees as well, where this similar rhetoric is being repeated and rehashed at times. Thanks God, with not the same results, but there is a connection here. So what I decided is briefly kind of focus on some aspects of impact on the victims at this particular time, but later I can also talk about other things which maybe, people might be interested in. So my background is in linguistics and sociology. So this is primarily where I come from when I talk about these things. I have 7 I will make them brief points. They're not that brief, but I will make them brief for now, which I would like to point out. The first one, which is important for me, is that this type of inflammatory and divisive speech that we are talking about today is very important in this particular case, as we've seen, and Professor Lisa has showed this to us in such an amazing manner. I felt like I was actually being there in the courtroom now again. But I do want us to remember that this is one ring in a long chain of speech acts that have occurred before this and continued to occur after this. So, for example, I don't know of myself without being exposed in one way or another to some sort of these narratives. So neither for the victims or those incited to attack, as we heard, is this a novelty or the first time to hear some of these sayings, these words, not maybe as harsh as they were at this particular moment, but this is something that has been around. People who attended, when they reacted to the speech, they reacted because of the fact that they've been exposed to similar type of speeches before, and that allows for such an escalation to happen. So it's not only that it's prolonged, but my second point is that this has been structurally enabled for a long time in terms of social, political, cultural elites produce and reproduce this language and are invested in this language. And as we heard, this is not just anyone. This is a university lecturer. This is someone who's published books on some of these matters. And these have been structurally enabled for quite a long time, a time that served to promote these ideas, in this case, the ideas of supremacist ethno-nationalism. These obviously ideas have a purpose, and my third point is the purpose. This doesn't happen for nothing. This doesn't happen in vacuum. This happens with a very clear purposes of, when taken to its logical conclusion, annihilation of a group, cancellation of a group, erasure of a group. But also we hear this talk, inflammatory talk, outside of a conflict context that's used in order to stop people from coming to a country or make it difficult for people to access some capitals or resources in the society, like land, like natural resources, etc. I think it was very perfectly shown in the examples Professor Lisa offered, how this one particular group that's needed for this purpose is actually imagined. How people are called all sorts of names, considered traitors, disloyal, dehumanized, or connected to some particular assumed historical event that happened years ago, and all of a sudden they're equalized with a group that did something or someone that did something 50 or more years ago. All sorts of different language devices are used that I'm not going to go into. But they do the work. And when I work with victims and we talk about this with people, people sometimes say like, but these things that saying about, in this case, for example, Croats or anyone, I mean, when we talk about these things, they're not true. And they might not be true, but they are real for the victims. They have real life consequences for the people that are being targeted, as we've seen, unfortunately, with this. These words in the prolonged historical context are enabled, allowed, normalized. I think one important concept is normalized. And people start believing that. So people start believing this is actually true. These people are our enemies. They're actually attacking us. We actually need to fight back or do whatever is necessary to survive. But also I want to just highlight another aspect is that these words become internalized also, not only by the dominant group, but also the dominated group. People start thinking of themselves sometimes as those who don't have the right to live, don't have the right to be there, are to be blamed for what's happening to them. And for me personally, in this work, this is maybe the most important part in my work, to help people understand that they are not guilty for anything, that they don't deserve anything to be happening to them, that this is something that has a purpose, is structurally enabled, supported, and there is a reason for that. And it's not because who you are, but because what someone else wants, and it's serious political, social interests that are here at stake. Two other points that I will mention, and I will also stop here. Speech is not enough, however horrible the speech is, and we've exactly, again, seen that on this case. There need to be institutional, structural power and resources to back up what's being incited. And that's extremely important because sometimes when we talk, for example, in my work about hate crimes and incitement and how people are repeatedly attacked, some people will easily say this could easily escalate. There are conditions that are necessary to be there in place for things to escalate. So what I want to say is that same language in different contexts will have different results. And again, we've heard this very well, how important evidence around these cases is to show how things escalate and to show what kind of context we are talking about. We do have some small instruments that I use in my work to see like where could this go or what's going on and like collecting all sorts of language that's being uttered around certain incidents, because this is an indication for us to maybe expect something else, to see what's going to happen. And this likelihood, like this famous likelihood of harm, like how likely will this cause or did this cause serious harm? Including, obviously, this imminence. How imminent is this, what's going to happen? And this causal link, like how is this linked to what occurred or is occurring? And my last point is not a very happy one, but in my personal experience and as a practitioner and as a human being, the narratives never stop. It's a chain, again, transmitted, intergenerationally transmitted chain of beliefs and attitudes, of memories and myths that can be activated at different times. It depends, obviously, on the context, on social, geopolitical circumstances, but it's something that stays with us. So until today, narratives around traitors, narratives around people who don't belong, narratives of people, narratives around everything we heard in this presentation before, these narratives stay with us, and they are activated, reactivated during election campaigns, during whatever political issues that might be happening or we might be having in the region. So I was working on a case recently, a returnee, a person who returned to what is today the entity of Republika Srpska Bratunac, has a small shop. He's a small shop owner. Even till today, every now and then a shop is attacked, a stone is thrown here, a graffiti written there, derogatory wording said to him and his family, and the fear is there for him. And he feels there is also impunity, that when he invites police, the police will not react, that police in a way is implicated, that the institutions are implicated for all sorts of reasons. Because also some people who were present in the army during the war are currently, for example, holding some police functions as well in the country. So all of this is obviously very complex, and I'm very happy we are talking about these things today, because I'm personally committed to working on these issues, especially on the issues of how these narratives become internalized, how people, be it from any dominant group or dominated group, start actually thinking about themselves in these ideas of superior group, inferior group, and how I believe in order for someone to dehumanize others, they need to be dehumanized first. And this work of understanding these narratives for all of us in the region, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, others, or other people who are dealing with narratives, and we are all dealing with these types of narratives across the globe, unfortunately. This for me is extremely, extremely important, that we kind of continue working on this without losing hope. I will conclude here, and I will share, which is something I don't usually share. I'm not someone who does these talks around genocide survival. I support it, I'm part of it, but I usually don't share my story. But I will just briefly say that I was 10 when the war broke out. I come from a small town in central Bosnia. We were expelled from that town called Donji Vakuf. This town also changed the name, or had its name changed, into Srbobran, which means defender of the Serbs. In our house, my house, there was a Serb family that moved in, a father and 2 girls, young girls my age. We didn't have access to our home for 4 years. When I came back to my home, I found their toys and their notebooks and stuff. And I kept some of them and I played with them. So I moved more than 20 times in my life, and I'm not even 45. Half of them wasn't by my own volition or choice. So this deeply influenced my entire life. And speeches like that, and other speeches obviously influenced my life beyond each particular event that happened to me, in terms of when I was expelled and when we left, etc. But also, like, up till to this day, we are dealing with these narratives, and I think we are all dealing with them, all of us here currently in this region, in the Balkans. And I'm really committed to working with other people as well on the issues relating to facing the past and working on a better future for all of us. So I'll stop here. I think I provided some insight into what I'm doing and what I can offer. So if there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Vala Germana, and a special thank you for sharing your experience, because you have, as you said, 2 headscarves in terms of professional perspective, dealing with these issues in the OSCE and other settings, but also having experience, and that is quite poignant and quite it affects you when you hear that there were people your own age, young daughters, who of course were probably innocent in every way themselves. But what struck me in particular was your reference to this intergenerational chain of, I think, false narratives, memories, and myths. And I think we saw in the prosecutions in the former Yugoslavia how a lot of those events in the 90s were founded on events from World War II and thereafter. And it sounds like we unfortunately continue to see some of the echoes of those same sentiments. So thank you again, and I think it's fascinating with Lisa also having had a personal involvement in sense of having been one of the lead prosecutors on the Seselj case. And she didn't mention this, but she actually cross-examined Vojislav Seselj himself, which was, I was in the courtroom for that, so it was quite an interesting experience. I do see excellent questions, and so I'm going to read those out. Hopefully you can see them as well. And so the first one is for Lisa. What lessons can be drawn from the Seselj trial so that future hate speech prosecutions are more successful? And while you think of that, I'll just add in a couple more questions. So for Germana, brilliant presentation, and I very much agree with that. You mentioned work to de-internalize the effects of these hate speeches. What are some concrete steps, activities that could be taken with communities to de-internalize such hatred, such as in transitional justice? Very good. And then another question, apart from Seselj, other international criminal prosecutions that have dealt with hate speech and have contributed to the jurisprudence that can be built upon in the future. I mean, that's one I've been working on a little bit. So happy to chip in with a few words, but for now, maybe Lisa, if we pass to you first.
Yeah, thank you. It's, you know, to this day, I still ask myself that question, and that what lessons can be drawn from the Seselj trial so that future hate speech prosecutions are more successful. To this day, I think about this. And I think it goes to show that there are a few things, but it was so unusual a case that it's hard to make a plan. I think the one major thing, and I think the work is being done, is clarifying the jurisprudence in this regard. And I see significant work on this, and there have been lots of proposals about how to bring together the different fragments. And I think it's Gregory Gordon, he talks about this fragmentation in the jurisprudence and this need to bring some kind of clarity to it. I think that's the first thing. I think another really important aspect is around how we protect witnesses. And Germana talked about it a little bit, you know, people who are being victimized in their own communities. And some of these witnesses, even though they have some degree of protection in the courtroom, maybe it was voice distortion or a pseudonym or whatever it is, but when you have an accused like Seselj, who during trial was convicted 3 times for revealing the identities of witnesses, it's a serious issue. And I think that this is a big challenge to future institutions about how they're going to do this and do it well. So those for me are the 2 main components. I know, Matthew, you probably have more detailed comments in regard to the other cases. But for that reason, I had asked you, I don't know if the participants can see it, to include the resource list of not only Predrag Dojcinovic, Gregory, Gordon, and your work with the Hartford guidelines, and Audrey Fino, I believe. So those are very good resources to get deeper into the subject.
Yeah, thank you. I've shared them in the chat, so I hope they're available to everybody. Thank you very much, Lisa. Germana, over to you. Tell me if you want me to repeat the question.
The question, let's go, because I just went and saw several questions. So I'm going to which one? Which one? The
first one from David Esposito,
okay.
yes.
The internalized one, yeah, the internalized hatred. I would say I'm working on these issues with people. We try to deconstruct the narratives. So I would say there are two parts here. The first part is a rational part. Rational part in terms of deconstructing narratives, deconstructing frameworks, understanding how these language devices work, how they were built and for what purpose, and explaining them rationally. That's an easier bit, I would say. The more difficult part is the emotional part, psychological part. For too long, people have believed about themselves certain things to be true. And it's not enough to just say one day, okay, now this is not true anymore. From tomorrow, we start thinking about ourselves as beautiful, worthy, having the right to live on this earth, not victims, not being connected to our identity as victims, not identifying with what happened to us, or, and we just continue on. This is the more difficult part. It requires space. It requires safe space. It requires time. It requires very well-skilled professionals who will hold space for people to release these years and years of wrong attitudes and wrong beliefs about themselves. And there are ways how this can be done. There are programs that do this. I often do this with people during my trainings that start just as informative trainings around Islamophobia or racism and end up being sometimes support groups where people cry or leave the room or come back, are triggered a lot. And, I try working on that and referring them to services. It's extremely important to have referral mechanisms, a list of institutions where you can refer people, ideally free of charge, so they can actually, once they accept they can work on this, start work on this. But many people also don't want to. It's difficult. There is a huge denial around these issues, because once you actually become aware of this and you accept this is true, there is work to be done. But it can be done, and people are working on this. I have a quote from James Baldwin. So Matthew, if you can just maybe find it there, which I find really important in this work. Yeah, so he says here, it took many years of vomiting up all the filth I've been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on the earth as though I had a right to be here. And for me, this resonates a lot, and I use it quite often in my work. It's a long process, but it can be done. So that's just a brief response to this question. I hope it's good enough.
Thank you. And next from Massimo Moratti. Hi, thanks for the wonderful presentation, which I feel very close. I'm part of the so-called Essex Mafia. Welcome. And I worked in Bosnia for almost 10 years. Immediately after the war, I now live and work in Serbia, where I witnessed the rising of Vucic and the former radicals, and I can witness how these narratives are still present and how the political system in Serbia and Republika Srpska continues to fuel hatred and tensions. Any suggestions to defeat these narratives today, especially in Serbia where freedom of media is limited? And I guess that's for both of you.
It's a powerful question. It's a very powerful and important question. And, you know, I'm hearing in that question, it's like this sense of powerlessness, watching the situation worsen and wondering how bad it needs to get before things change. And I, strangely enough, even in certain other parts of the country, of the world, that is very much alive as an issue. And I'm not sure I have anything profound to say about it. I think one of the things that comes up for me is how we manage how I manage my own attitudes towards those that the group on whose behalf this inflammatory rhetoric is being centered, and this instinct to isolate myself and to see them, in fact, in my everyday life as potential enemies. And I think this is the success of systems like this, is when it works on us as individuals to a point where we start shutting off and we start expressing our fear in our everyday lives. So I know for myself, that's something that I connect to, in addition to trying to find organizations that can help support, whether NGOs or otherwise. But it's a very, it's too bad this is not a dialogue, because I'm so curious about what the person asking the question has contemplated, and what may be the current experiences with that directly at home.
And Massimo, if you do want to follow up to Lisa's invitation, then do feel free to write further. Germana, I wondered if you had anything to add on that question.
Very briefly, obviously it's a very, very complex and very difficult situation. Defeating narratives is extremely difficult. Ideally, there needs to be a counter narrative that's stronger than that, politically, socially, culturally stronger. And I don't see such a narrative emerging to that extent. But I think the first step is actually seeing it for what it is. Like deconstructing and understanding what's going on for yourself, for people around you, and build solidarity with other people who also see it for what it is. That's a kind of a way to stay sane, for me at least. And then do the work you can do. I think many people get burnout because they think that, like, you know, you can do more than you can. And understanding your limits of what you can and cannot do helps you being persistent and consistent with whatever you can do. It might not be much, but it is something. I think everyone can chip away from this a little bit. That's my brief answer, and there is a longer one, but I'm not going to go into that now.
Okay, and we have from Gulberg Gur. Thank you for this webinar. It is really important for me because Kurds and Levis have been exposed to this dehumanization process for a long time in the country I come from. I have two questions. Firstly, a question to Lisa Biersay. As I read, Seselj was acquitted, and then in the trial judgment in 2018, and then the appeals chamber sentenced Seselj to 10 years imprisonment when it declared he'd already served his sentence while awaiting trial. So what does that mean exactly? Was he arrested during that trial period and I guess in detention for 10 years? How do you interpret the situation? And then a separate question, which is, I would like to ask the problem of the so-called black humor. This is important, especially in the age of technology, as I know extremist writers use this type of humor a lot, but it actually seems as hate speech. I would love to hear Germana Kuric's opinion on this issue, even if it is caricature, for instance. So thanks a lot. And whichever of you, Lisa, why don't you go first?
I can describe a little bit of the procedural history. After Seselj was indicted, he surrendered and he was detained in February 2003. And he was ordered released by the trial chamber. A majority, 2 out of the 3 judges, brought their own motion to release him on medical grounds in November of 2014. So that's why when he was sentenced to 10 years, they were able to say that he had already served the time because he had already been in custody since February 2003.
And it was a long, convoluted trial with many ups and downs, as Lisa mentioned. I should say I did work with her in some respects on this trial, and the conviction at the end of trial on appeal and a sentence of 10 years imprisonment is particularly notable because it really came down to that speech in Hertkovci, as Lisa has outlined, and that's really unique. I think that's the only case we have where it is at the international level based on one singular speech, and of course the surrounding events and context, but in terms of his actions, it was that one speech. Germana, the question on black humor.
So first, maybe 2 points. First, it is so important. Jokes, black humor, normalize dehumanization, normalize stigmatization. It becomes accepted that you can joke on someone's account in relation to their identity, in relation to their ethnic, racial, whatever background. It's a very sophisticated way to normalize these types of beliefs that later on can escalate into all sorts of things, especially with the online world. And I've seen several hate crimes committed, the burning of the Quran in Sweden, or the Christchurch in New Zealand, or a Breivik case in Norway, where they used lots of different mimes and the manifesto, and they were referring also to the war crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in a joking way, or in a really way that was like triumphant, supportive of what happened. So, and all of them had a history of online presence and lots of black humor and jokes. So it can be an indicator, and we need to be aware of this. And we also need to be more cautious about our own language and what we use and what we allow for other people to use or enable other people to use around us. But it's a huge problem, obviously, difficult to deal with legally, because unless there is clear incitement, unless there is a clear threat, it's very difficult to actually do anything with that. But when the case is built, it can be used against the person. If the person actually later on commits something, this black humor, if found online, is something that corroborates the intention or the bias. So this is where it can play a role, so to say. Second thing which I wanted to mention around, for example, caricatures or this type of humor, it's also important who does it, from where, when, and how. We have this Rabat test. You can easily find it online, but it speaks around about some of these things we spoke about. It's like, who is speaking, from which position, does the person have power, who is listening to this or who is watching this if it's written online, and what are the circumstances under which this is happening, etc. There are several points in the Rabat test, but like all of these together combined mean that the same speech, as I said, or the same black humor in some instances can be fatal, in some instances less fatal, let's say.
And sticking with you, Germana, question from Hanin Murad. What exactly did you mean by saying for someone to dehumanize others, they themselves must be dehumanized first? And if you are willing, how do you, as someone that's personally affected by a genocide oppressive takeover, make sure to deal with these topics and not be overwhelmed? As a Palestinian international criminal lawyer, I'm currently struggling with this. Thank you so much, all three, for this informative session. Thank you for the questions, Hanin.
Thank you very much, Hanin, for your questions. So first, what I meant by this is when someone thinks they are members of a selected superior group, that's not human. They've dehumanized themselves in a way that they've started thinking about themselves, that they belong to some selected group, some special group, some superior group that has more rights over other people than they actually do as humans. I talked in details with some of my Serb friends or Croat friends or American friends who've been brought up with narratives about their exceptionality, their superiority, that it hindered their own humanity in a way. I would like to point out that this is only an explanation. It's not a justification in any way of any crime that someone commits. What happened to anyone in their childhood, past, throughout generations is never a justification to what that person or that group is doing. But it helps us understand how do we get here in some ways. At least for me, when I talked to my friends, I could see how they started thinking about themselves, certain things, and how it ended up the way it ended up. For me, it was helpful to try and understand this logic that's behind that, because for me, for many years, I just couldn't understand. I hope it helps. I hope it makes sense. For me, it does. But if that's not for you, it's also okay, of course. So this is extremely important question. When someone is personally affected by genocide, oppressive takeover, or any other systemic discrimination in a prolonged way, and when they deal with these topics, as we do, it will be overwhelming. It is overwhelming. For me, it's always overwhelming. But I've come to accept and adopt some techniques that help me stabilize myself and ground myself. I've been doing therapy for years now. For me, it took years of therapy to be able to talk the way I'm talking now. And still today, my voice can tremble, shake, or I will not be ready to do this talk. And I, for example, told Matthew in the preparation of this talk, when he asked about recording, can we record this? I said to him, my PTSD is triggered sometimes it's not. Sometimes I'm afraid, sometimes I'm not. It depends. It really depends. I'm now starting to learn more about it, and I have ways how I deal with this, but it's never a guarantee that I will not be overwhelmed. I do need more time, and I always needed more time, even working on hate crimes, than my other colleagues who were not exposed to this, even to deal with a case. To cry it out, to think about it, to sit with the victim. It just takes more time for me than for my other colleagues who didn't have this experience. And I had times when I felt like I was not doing it well, or I'm not professional enough. But then I understood that I just have different experience, and my experience takes time. My work takes time. I just cannot do it as fast as some other colleagues do it. And there are many things I would say, but like, protect yourself, work on your own mental health, disengage when it's too much, because we are of no help to anyone else if we cannot be stable enough. Maybe not, never fully stable, but stable enough. I pray you will find your way, and I hope your people will inshallah be in a better situation relatively soon. I also wanted to point out one other thing. I'm a believing woman. And in my book, either we all have a soul or no one has a soul. That's a very difficult theological problem for me, was for a long time. How to deal with this theologically, I'm not going to enter into this now, but it's also an avenue that I explored and helped me tremendously to deal with my own situation.
Thanks again, Germana, and particularly for sharing those personal insights and also the tips, the techniques, because from what I can see, there are others in similar boats in some ways. And so I would actually extend the question to Lisa, because I know you've dealt with victim witnesses and also in your professional work. I mean, obviously you deal with very heavy cases and difficult cases, insider witnesses who may have very mixed motivations. Are there any techniques you would recommend? I know there are some aspiring human rights lawyers and human rights activists in the audience. So any techniques that you've picked up in your years of experience along the same lines about making sure you can preserve your own well-being?
This is such an important topic, and it would have been missing if we didn't address it. And I'm so grateful for the person who asked the question and for Germana answering it in such an authentic way. One of the things that is often not discussed by professionals is the toll it takes on us, even if we're not victims ourselves. But as professionals, it does take its toll, and it's something that is, I think it has become easier in the profession to discuss, but it has been a long time coming to talk about secondary trauma. And the secondary trauma that affects interpreters, lawyers, investigators, anyone looking at these images and hearing these stories. And for myself, actually, I am a practitioner of mindfulness, and I am I'm qualified as a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, because I feel that it's so important. And I went down this path and wanted to make sure I could hold the space for others. And I think there are lots of courses available around mindfulness from many traditions, not just in the one that I named, which comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again, Lisa. And I know again that you dealt with the stress also of the situation you're dealing with, but also the stresses, within the courtroom. It's quite stressful to have a very confrontational cross-examination with someone who may be extremely intelligent, but also quite obstructive at the same time. And so I think it's really helpful from what you say. In terms of, I see that, please go ahead, Lisa.
I would also add that, well, in the courtroom context, leaving the courtroom and having colleagues that you can joke with or cry with, whichever it is you having a safe harbor at work was one of my lifelines, let's say.
And really important, you're dealing with these situations, and really important to hear from both of yourselves who've, again, worn those sort of two hats, at least, vicariously Lisa dealing with so many victim witnesses, and Germana yourself. I see Massimo has followed up. Thank you, Massimo. Noting, for instance, Mladic's portrait was guarded. That's Ratko Mladic, the former military commander of the Bosnian Serb army, and he was convicted of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And so he notes that Mladic's portrait was guarded by the police. What I noticed in Serbia is that people seem to completely ignore reports or judgments of crimes committed by Serb forces while reacting to crimes committed against Serbs, and everything is rather relativized. All committed crimes, we are all the same. I think that brings us to the current position we're in modern times. And one question, and the last question from me that I had for both of you was, in this age of digital information and social media platforms, how you feel that holding perpetrators of the most grave forms of hate speech, so incitement to grave crimes, but also criminalized hate speech, can be achieved, just given this modern globalized world in which there's so much information emerging. What challenges do you see, and what prospects in that? And maybe I'll ask Lisa first, just to throw you in there.
Thank you. That's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very big one. And the one that comes up for me is, how can we possibly find some centralized way of collecting this information before it disappears, in a strategic way? I think that is one of the biggest issues. I mean, there are obviously organizations like Bellingcat, but I don't think that they do that. So it's, how can we create a repository and at the same time maybe do some kind of verification for authenticity and that along those lines. It's a big topic, and I think that there needs to be a dedicated forum to explore these ideas. And for my part, that's what most concerns me, is the preservation and archiving and the authentication of it.
Thank you. And Germana.
First, in relation to Massimo's additional comment, I think we need to mention, I think it's a good moment now to mention this, that when we talk about these supremacist, ethno-nationalist narratives, or any supremacist narrative, the narrative, how it works, is that anything that comes up its way that's against that is going to be somehow weaponized and put into whatever role, into whatever box it needs to be put for the supremacist narrative to continue. So the denial will happen and is happening, which Massimo is explaining, and even the judgments of the court, of the international tribunals, will be also talked about in this regard, as if something didn't happen, as if there is some conspiracy, as if this, is because of whoever hates whomever. So it's very difficult when there is such a narrative that's all-encompassing and so dominant. Like, whatever comes up its way will be somehow, used, and still the narrative continues. It's a very tough animal, so to say. I don't know how to explain it better. It will say, like, yeah, we're all the same. It will use different language techniques in terms of just denying what actually happened. Something about this whole online world and the misinformation and the disinformation that's omnipresent, I would say. At a very low scale level, so to say. I think building resilience, personal resilience, personal critical thinking, personal logical thinking, and verifying for ourselves what we are exposed to, like trying to control. This is what I'm trying to do. not being exposed to things that I haven't verified or checked, or just going off social media. I've started really using less and less and less of anything online because of this, how difficult this gets. I really don't have a better response, something central, ideally, something that would be, yes, covering that, but this is really, really difficult.
I would certainly second that last comment, that it is challenging and a really difficult time that we live in many respects, particularly when it comes to speech crimes and online hate. At this point, I think we have had a fantastic range of questions, and I thank the participants online who sent those questions through, really well thought out. And I really thank, I see some former colleagues, Fraser, Magdalena, Kyle, who worked at the Yugoslav Tribunal, and I'm glad to see their ongoing interest in this field, because I think your experience and your work continues, unfortunately, to be very relevant to modern events. The people I really want to thank the most are, firstly, Kat Freeman from the events team here at Essex for organizing everything and keeping us in a straight line, let's say. And then the excellent presentations by our experts, Elisa Biersay and Germana Kuric. And I have to say, this is a talk where I have felt, far beyond most talks that I go to, there has been a intermeshing of your personal experiences and your professional expertise. And I think that has really shone through and made it very poignant and very impactful. So I thank you for being willing to openly share those experiences. So with that, Vala, thank you to all over wherever you are in the world. I wish you peace and safety and happiness. And we hope to see you soon in future talks on topics related to international criminal law and human rights. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you
so much. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.